This episode of The History Guy brought to you by NordVPN. Take control of your internet experience today. On May 14th, 1804, the Corps of Discovery set out from Camp Dubois, north of St. Louis, on one of the most famous expeditions in American history. That expedition has become enshrined in the American mythos as a legendary historic journey across unexplored land and the first step in making the United States a transcontinental empire. But they were not, in fact, the first Europeans to cross America and reach the Pacific. Instead, a Scottish-born explorer is given credit for the first east-to-west journey across America north of Mexico. And while not nearly as well known, the adventures and journal of Sir Alexander Mackenzie deserve to be remembered. You've heard me talk about NordVPN before. As the history guy, I do a lot of research online, and I need to be able to surf securely. And NordVPN is super easy to use. It's just one click. NordVPN makes sure that your IP address is always hidden, but they won't track, collect, or share your data because your internet history is none of their business. And with more than 5,400 servers in 59 countries, with NordVPN you can enjoy the internet with no limits or borders. NordVPN has always been the history guy's VPN, but now it's gotten even better. A VPN hides your IP address and encrypts your data, which protects you from internet pirates. Arrgh! But a VPN only does so much, and that is why NordVPN is becoming more than a VPN with threat protection. Now your NordVPN will also protect you against malware, malicious websites, trackers, and intrusive ads. And does that even if you aren't connected to a VPN server. Even if you accidentally download a malicious file, the threat protection will scan it, delete it, because that is history that you don't want to remember. All you have to do is go into your NordVPN app and click on this handy shield here. So take control of your internet experience today with NordVPN. And right now, you can get a special offer, 2 years at a huge discount, plus an additional month free by using the link nordvpn.com/thehistoryguy. And it's risk-free with NordVPN's 30-day money-back guarantee. That's nordvpn.com/thehistoryguy, or use the link in the description. Alexander Mackenzie was born around 1764 on the island of Lewis and Harris, Scotland's largest island and part of the Outer Hebrides. Mackenzie was the third of the 4 children of Kenneth Mackenzie and Isabella McIver. The family was of moderate means, but the economy in Lewis was bad, and after the death of his mother in 1774, Alexander and his father left Scotland for New York City. His father and uncle were loyalists during the American War for Independence and fought with the King's Royal Regiment of New York. In 1778, Alexander was sent to Montreal for his own safety. By the following year, Alexander became an apprentice with Finlay, Gregory and Company, an influential fur trading company based in Montreal. Montreal in 1779 was central to the fur trade. Still half garrison and half port, it was from there that the St. Lawrence River fur trading empire spread, bringing fortunes back to Europe. Mackenzie's first job was as a clerk, where he would file papers and learn accounting practices. In 1780, his father died while still serving in the army, apparently from scurvy. Mackenzie would remain with the growing and changing fur company, which in 1787 merged with the Northwest Company. From an early age, Alexander seems to have been confident and ambitious. In the book he wrote about his adventures, he said he was endowed by nature with an inquisitive mind and enterprising spirit, and that he was confident in the qualifications, as I was animated by the desire to undertake the perilous enterprise of crossing the Canadian wilderness to the Pacific Ocean. Europeans had been involved in fur trading in Canada for nearly 2 centuries by the time Mackenzie became involved, and fur trappers lived on the edge of society, tenuous connections from the wilderness to the banks and trading centers of London, Moscow, and even Canton. Living in that wilderness required sturdy men and pragmatic traders who often in isolation built relationships with Native Americans through gifts, always looking for a new advantage in the cutthroat business of controlling the fur trade. From Montreal, new trading operations were being built progressively west, and by 1778, Grand Portage was the main transshipping point between east and west. In 1784, he left the counting house with a small adventure of goods to seek my fortune in Detroit. He was invited to become a partner in the company on the condition that he would proceed into the wilderness the following spring, and he immediately accepted. From there he first served in what is now Saskatchewan at Ile-à-la-Crosse, in a region the traders called English River. He was in charge of managing traders and supervising employees. As was common among traders, he probably took a native wife at about this time. These women and the families that came from them were valuable both as connections to the local tribes and as interpreters. The region, called Athabasca, was first reached by Northwest Company founder Peter Pond in 1778. Pond's maps and his belief that he had found the beginnings of the famed Northwest Passage would be a tremendous influence on Mackenzie. Since at least 1497, sailors had been dispatched from Europe in search of a passage around the American continent to Asia that could replace the time-consuming journeys by sea or land to Asia. Although Samuel Hearne had proved in 1772 that no strait existed between the Hudson Bay and the Pacific, many still hoped a navigable river route to the West Ocean existed. If there was no passage, then a trade route that could connect to the Pacific via rivers and trading posts could do as well. After reading about James Cook's discovery of Cook's Inlet, described as a river, Pond believed that the inlet was connected by river and lakes to the rest of Canada. Pond hoped to manage an expedition to prove it, but would be pushed out of the Northwest Company in 1788, partially thanks to the deaths of two men with which he was involved. In 1788, after his company had merged with the Northwest Company, Mackenzie was sent to replace Pond, and the pair worked together for some time. They were together founders of Fort Chipewyan, named for the First Nations people in the area and one of the oldest European settlements in modern Alberta. Pond's departure allowed Mackenzie to make use of what the company called the New El Dorado, and became rich off the trade from Athabasca. Many others were considering the possibility that the lakes of Athabasca eventually connected to the Pacific by river, and a Montreal judge went so far as to declare one of the Athabascan rivers Cook's River. The judge also reported that Mackenzie had orders to reach England by traveling west, eventually crossing Russia. The company was planning an expedition, but not with Mackenzie. Mackenzie, separate from everyone, was planning his own expedition in the name of profit. He maligned Pond, claiming the man had wild ideas that were incomprehensibly extravagant, while using Pond's information to make his own assessment. He informed his cousin Roderick, also with the Northwest Company, of his intentions, and his cousin promised to take over management at Athabasca while Alexander explored. In 1789, Mackenzie prepared to follow the river that drained north from the Great Slave Lake, then called the Great River of the North by early explorers and the River Big by the natives. Mackenzie owed much to his native guides, and just before leaving wrote that without the natives, I have little hope of succeeding. He left with the party from Fort Chipewyan on June 3rd by canoe. With him was a Northwest Company clerk, 4 other Canadians, 2 with their wives, and a German man. Also along was a First Nations leader he called Nestebec, along with a small party of First Nations hunters. Their departure in June was as early as melting ice allowed, and the long journey north would involve numerous portages, where the company had to carry the canoes and all their supplies around rapids and other obstacles. Weather, mosquitoes, and river ice remained constant troubles. On June 23rd, they met with a group of Yellowknives, a First Nations people, and part of the party remained to open a trading post, while Alexander continued north with Nestebec. It took them days to find the huge river the judge had dubbed Cook's River, but on June 29th, they were finally following it northwest out of the Great Slave Lake. As the journey passed into July, it became troublingly clear that the Rocky Mountains remained between them and the Pacific, preventing the river from flowing west. One group of natives they found insisted that the explorers would be years reaching the northern ocean, and Mackenzie had to talk his own guides into continuing, as they feared there would be no animals further north. Still, they continued, leaving the Athabascan people behind and entering Inuit territory, so far north now that days became endlessly light. It was becoming clear to Mackenzie that the river didn't end at the Pacific, but in the Arctic Ocean. On July 12th, they stopped at an island where they could see water covered with ice for 6 miles. On July 14th, Mackenzie set a post that had his name, the date, and the latitude on an island that remains unidentified. On the same day, across the world, the Bastille was stormed in Paris. On the return journey, Mackenzie plied the natives with gifts in an attempt to learn information about rivers going west or about the land past the mountains. But none of them would agree to go with him, telling him that beyond the mountains were people that kill men with their eyes. Mackenzie thought the natives knew more than they choose to tell me, and that his interpreter may conceal from me, as Nestebec and the others wanted to return home and not do any more exploration. They reached Fort Chipewyan on September 12th, having traveled 3,000 miles in 102 days. The river he traveled has been named the Mackenzie River, although many First Nations people continue to use the original name, De Cho, meaning Big River, for it. Mackenzie had successfully mapped and brought reports of the plants, animals, and peoples of that far-off north, itself significant. A possibly apocryphal story notes that despite his success, Mackenzie dubbed the river Disappointment. In addition to failing to find a Northwest Passage, many men ignored or belittled Mackenzie's accomplishment, either because he was not as learned in science or cartography, or possibly because of jealousy over the valued nature of the increased trade deeper into Canada. Mackenzie was far from satisfied with what recognition he got. He spent the winter of 1789-90 in England, learning more about determining latitude and cartography, determined to make his name another way. By 1792, he had returned to Canada and was ready to begin an even greater journey. In the fall, he traveled as far west as he could and established a post along the Peace River, which he dubbed Fort Fork. He learned from the natives of a river on the west slope of the Rockies and was able to get 2 guides to show him the way through. "I send you a couple of guineas," he wrote his cousin. "The rest I take with me to traffic with the Russians." His exact plans are unknown. Did he mean to travel across Russia? Certainly he hoped to open trade from Canada to Russia and to China, still closed off from most foreign trade. "Should I be successful, I shall retire to greater advantage," he wrote. "Should I not be successful, I cannot be worse off than I am at present." His companions all feared the journey impossible, one shedding tears on the reflection of those dangers. With him he brought a 25-foot canoe, 1.5 tons of baggage, 8 men, including himself, plus 2 native interpreters, and a dog, which they only called "our dog." Traveling upriver and into the mountains was difficult, involving many portages. Mackenzie repeatedly plied his men with rum to keep them moving instead of trying to return to civilization. On native advice, he took what we now know as the harder trip at a fork, following the Parsnip River. They came upon a group of Sakonnet people who told of having traded on the west side of the mountains and of a stinking lake and European ships. But the way was long, and his men were tired. Here he nearly despaired, writing only that returning was an idea too painful to indulge. By June 12th, they finally reached a stream that flowed west towards the Pacific. The journey, however, was anything but downhill from there. Portaging through some rapids, a few men remained on the canoe to guide it through. The crew insisted that Mackenzie be on the boat, declaring that if they perished, I should perish with them. The canoe was struck almost immediately as it sailed into the river, swinging sideways. Mackenzie and the crew jumped overboard, hanging onto the gunwales. They were forced to get back on as the boat careened through the rapids, tearing holes and smashing the stern. All of their musket balls were lost. They were forced to build a new canoe, but one of the guides ran off on June 17th. Finally, they found a navigable river, which eventually became the modern Fraser River. They met another group of First Nations people who informed Mackenzie that it was a short trip by land to the coast. Mackenzie thought he was on the Columbia River, though he was actually hundreds of miles north of it. Instead of trying to follow the river, he left his canoe and chose to head west overland. He and his party followed an ancient trade path, Grease Trail, where oil from the coast moved westward, a path walked for millennia by Native Americans. Overland, the journey was still difficult, beset by hail, snow, and rain. By July 19th, he had finally laid eyes on the ocean, and the following day took a canoe lent by locals to its edges. Over the following days, he took his all-important measurements of latitude and longitude to prove to the world that he had reached the west coast. As he attempted to, however, he met another group of natives, much less friendly, who claimed that they had been fired upon by a white man named Makuba, probably George Vancouver, who had been there only weeks before as part of his 4.5-year voyage that had taken him across the Pacific by way of the Horn of Africa, although Vancouver's party reported no trouble with the locals. By canoe, Mackenzie fled to a small island now called Mackenzie Rock, fearing an attack. Instead, the natives were mostly peaceful, stealing a hat and trading some otter pelts. The measurements he took were off, but reasonably close given the reliability of his instruments. Then he mixed up some vermilion in melted grease and drew in large characters, "Alexander Mackenzie, from Canada, by land, the 22nd of July, 1793, upon a rock." It was only later that the message was carved more permanently into the stone. Oral histories also record Mackenzie making those marks. The return trip thus began, as they retraced their steps. As they reached the Continental Divide, Mackenzie's ankles were so swollen he had to be carried. Now traveling downriver east, they made quick progress. On August 24th, they reached Fort Fork. "Here my voyages of discovery terminate," he wrote, apparently with much relief. Mackenzie left Athabasca in 1794, never to return. He sought to bring news and proof, for example, his sea otter pelts, of his journey. He met with, among others, the lieutenant governor of Upper Canada. Most interesting to the British was the value of the newly explored land for trade, especially with China. Alexander Mackenzie continued in business with the Northwest Company until he formed his own company and became wealthy before retiring back to Scotland. He was knighted by George III in 1802 following the publication of his journals, the Voyages from Montreal. Those journals were part of what inspired Thomas Jefferson to form the Corps of Discovery, as he realized the geopolitical possibilities of laying a claim to the West Coast. Mackenzie's journal was a key inspiration for Jefferson's Corps of Discovery and that famous trip by Lewis and Clark. And while he is not nearly as well remembered in the Americas, he beat them to the Pacific by more than a dozen years. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguyguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you have to do is subscribe.